February 26,
The Marines had trained for
1945.
hell, but nothing
A
prepared them for
23-year-old
Iwo
farm
Jima.
boy from rural
Every inch of
Alabama
ground was
stepped onto the black
Every crater
volcanic
and
beaches of
death
Iwo Jima, carrying a weapon that every Marine in the Pacific hated. The Browning automatic rifle weighed 20 pounds fully loaded, twice as heavy as a standard M1 Garand. Military doctrine said it was too clunky, too slow, completely wrong for the lightning-fast combat of island warfare. Officers wanted it removed from frontline units. Training manuals relegated it to fixed defensive positions. Every Marine who carried it complained about the weight, the awkward balance, the impossible ammunition load. But in exactly 15 minutes on a blood-soaked hilltop, Private Wilson Watson would use this obsolete weapon to single-handedly wipe out 60 Japanese soldiers and prove that everything the military thought it knew about automatic weapons was dead wrong. 1 Marine, 1 gun, 60 enemy troops. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. The Pacific War in early 1945 was a nightmare of blood and volcanic ash. American forces had been island hopping for 3 brutal years, each battle more savage than the last. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, names written in American blood across thousands of miles of ocean. The pattern was always the same: massive naval bombardment that seemed to pulverize everything, amphibious landings under murderous fire. Then weeks of brutal close-quarters combat against Japanese defenders who refused to surrender. The mathematics of island warfare were simple and terrible. For every Japanese soldier killed, the Marines paid in blood. Tarawa cost 3,000 American casualties to take an island barely 2 miles long. Saipan killed or wounded 13,000 Americans. Peleliu, which was supposed to take 4 days, consumed 2 months and 10,000 casualties. The problem wasn't courage or training. American Marines were the best trained assault infantry in the world. The problem was tactical. Japanese defensive tactics had evolved specifically to counter American advantages in firepower and naval support. They had stopped defending beaches where American naval guns could blast them to pieces. Instead, they dug deep, created interconnected tunnel systems, and turned every island into an underground fortress designed to bleed the Marines white. By February 1945, American commanders were desperate for solutions. Conventional tactics weren't working. Every island cost more lives than the last. Intelligence reports about Iwo Jima suggested it would be the worst yet. The Japanese had spent 8 months fortifying 8 square miles of volcanic rock with 11 miles of tunnels, 1,500 rooms, carved into solid stone, and defensive positions that naval bombardment simply could not reach. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding 21,000 Japanese defenders, had studied American amphibious tactics and concluded that traditional banzai charges were suicide. His men would fight from prepared positions, forcing the Marines to dig them out 1 bunker at a time. Every cave, every tunnel, every piece of apparently open ground had been pre-sighted for artillery and mortar fire. American planners estimated it would take 5 days to secure the island. It would actually take 36 days and cost 26,000 American casualties, including 6,800 dead. Iwo Jima would become the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese losses. But nobody knew this yet when the invasion fleet approached on the morning of February 26th. All they knew was that 3 days of naval bombardment, the heaviest in Pacific War history, had seemingly turned the island into a moonscape. Surely nothing could have survived that hellstorm of high explosives. They were catastrophically wrong. Wilson Watson had never wanted to carry the Browning automatic rifle. Born in 1921 in rural Tuscumbia, Alabama, he grew up hunting rabbits and deer with his father's Springfield bolt-action rifle. His father had taught him that good marksmanship meant making every shot count, that spray and pray was for amateurs who didn't understand firearms. Watson learned to judge distance by eye, to compensate for wind, to place his shots with surgical precision. 1 shot, 1 kill. It was a philosophy built on Depression-era poverty, where ammunition was expensive and wasted bullets meant wasted money. That philosophy served him well through Marine Corps training at Parris Island, where his marksmanship scores earned him the attention of his drill instructors. Watson was quiet, methodical, the kind of Marine who absorbed instruction without complaint and executed orders with precision. He should have been assigned as a rifleman carrying the M1 Garand like most infantrymen. Instead, his platoon sergeant made a decision that would change history. The squad needed a barman. The previous carrier had been transferred out, and someone had to take the weapon. Watson's physical build, lean but strong from years of farm work, made him a candidate. More importantly, his calm temperament suggested he wouldn't panic under the stress of handling an automatic weapon in combat. So Watson became a barman, and he hated it. The weapon contradicted everything his father had taught him. It fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the Garand, but at a cyclic rate of 500 to 650 rounds per minute in full automatic mode. A 20-round magazine could be emptied in less than 3 seconds of sustained fire. The concept was fundamentally wasteful, spraying bullets instead of placing precise shots. Worse, the 20-pound weight made everything harder. Where riflemen could drop prone quickly or scramble between positions, Watson struggled under the bar's bulk. The weapon's bipod legs, theoretically designed for stability, caught on everything during training exercises. Most barmen removed them entirely, sacrificing the one advantage the weapon supposedly offered. The ammunition load was equally punishing. Standard doctrine called for the barman to carry 12 20-round magazines, 240 rounds total. The weight of ammunition alone approached 15 pounds. Add the weapon's 20 pounds, and his standard infantry kit, and Watson was carrying nearly 60 pounds of equipment before counting food, water, or additional supplies. Other Marines in his squad carried 8-round clips for their Garands light enough that they barely noticed the weight. They could move fast, fight light, and didn't spend every moment worrying about ammunition conservation. For 8 months through training camps from Parris Island to Camp Pendleton, Watson had carried this burden and questioned whether it served any purpose. The weapon's effective range stretched to 600 yards, impressive on paper, but meaningless in Pacific combat, where engagements typically occurred at ranges measured in dozens of yards, not hundreds. The Japanese fought from concealed positions, appearing suddenly at close range before disappearing into tunnel systems. Long-range automatic fire was useless against an enemy you couldn't see until they were already shooting at you. Every tactical exercise reinforced the same lesson. The bar was a weapon designed for European warfare, for open fields and distant machine gun nests, for a kind of combat that simply didn't exist in the Pacific. Watson wasn't alone in this assessment. Throughout the Marine Corps, the bar was being quietly phased out of frontline units. Officers were recommending its removal from infantry squads. Training manuals were being rewritten to emphasize rifle marksmanship over automatic fire. By 1945, military planners had essentially decided the weapon was obsolete, a relic from World War I that had no place in modern warfare. Watson would have agreed completely. Until Iwo Jima. The landing craft hit the beach at 09:02 hours, and for exactly 47 minutes, everything seemed almost easy. Watson's boots sank into the black volcanic sand so fine it was almost like powder, so dark it absorbed sunlight and radiated heat even in February. Around him, thousands of Marines were pouring ashore, wave after wave of landing craft, disgorging men and equipment onto beaches that aerial photographs had designated as green, red, yellow, and blue. The expected murderous defensive fire never came. A few scattered mortar rounds fell among the early waves, but nothing like the curtain of steel that had met Marines at Tarawa or Saipan. Naval bombardment seemed to have worked. Maybe Iwo Jima wouldn't be as bad as everyone feared. Watson's squad pushed inland, struggling up terraces of volcanic ash that collapsed under their weight. The island's defenders had built these terraces deliberately, forcing attackers to climb slopes where footing was nearly impossible, while defending troops above had stable firing positions. But still, no heavy fire. Marines were actually making jokes, wondering if the Japanese had evacuated the island. Some even suggested the battle might be over in a day or two. Then, at 0947, the island erupted. Japanese positions that aerial reconnaissance had missed or dismissed as destroyed revealed themselves through curtains of fire that swept the volcanic terrain. Mortars, artillery machine guns, everything opened up simultaneously in a coordinated barrage that turned the beachhead into a killing field. Marines who seconds earlier had been joking about an easy fight were now diving for cover that didn't exist on the barren volcanic slopes. The sound was unlike anything Watson had experienced in training. Japanese machine guns had a distinctive rapid-fire rhythm, different from the slower, heavier beat of American weapons. The Nambu Type 92 created a sustained buzz that mixed with the crack of rifle fire and the deeper thump of mortars and artillery. Men were falling everywhere. The black sand turned red. Screams mixed with the mechanical chatter of weapons. Watson's squad leader, Sergeant McMahon, was shouting orders that barely carried over the noise. They needed to move forward, couldn't stay pinned on the beach where they'd be destroyed by indirect fire. But moving forward meant advancing into clearly prepared killing zones where every piece of cover had been pre-registered for Japanese artillery. This was the nightmare American commanders had feared. The Japanese had allowed them to land in strength, let thousands of Marines bunch up on narrow beaches, then triggered a defensive plan that turned American numbers into a disadvantage. More troops meant more targets. The beachhead that should have been expanding was instead contracting under pressure from an enemy who held every advantage. Watson found himself in a depression in the volcanic rock, the bar clutched across his chest, trying to identify targets among the confusion of smoke and volcanic dust. Muzzle flashes appeared briefly from cave mouths, and hidden positions disappeared before he could aim, then reappeared somewhere else. The Japanese were using their tunnel systems to move between firing positions, making it impossible to suppress any single location. Traditional Marine tactics called for establishing a base of fire to pin down enemy positions, while assault elements maneuvered for attack. But you couldn't pin down an enemy who could disappear underground and emerge 50 yards away. Watson tried to follow doctrine, deploying the BR's bipod and attempting precise fire from a prone position. A Japanese machine gun position opened up from a cave mouth about 60 yards to his front. Watson returned fire, and his accuracy was good, rounds impacting around the cave entrance. Then, 3 mortar rounds landed within 20 yards of his position. He was forced to abandon his carefully prepared firing spot and scramble for new cover. The lesson was immediate and brutal. The bar's conventional role as a squad support weapon wasn't just ineffective, it was potentially suicidal. Japanese observers could spot static firing positions and direct mortar fire with lethal precision. Staying in one place to provide sustained, accurate fire meant dying under indirect fire before you could accomplish anything. Watson realized with sudden clarity that everything he'd been taught about employing the bar was wrong. Not slightly wrong, but fundamentally, completely, catastrophically wrong. The weapon wasn't designed for defensive positions or long-range fire support. Those were peacetime theories created by people who'd never faced an enemy who fought from underground fortresses connected by tunnels. The BR's real purpose, its actual tactical value, had never been discovered because nobody had been desperate enough or crazy enough to try using it the way it was meant to be used. 20 yards to Watson's left, Private McMahon was trying to engage the same machine gun position with his Garand. 8-round clips, accurate rifle fire, everything by the book. He was getting nowhere. The Japanese gunners would fire a burst duck back into the cave, wait for return fire to stop, then emerge and fire again. Conventional marksmanship was useless against this tactic. You needed sustained fire that could keep the enemy suppressed continuously, not allow them any window to shoot back. Watson made a decision that violated every principle of defensive warfare. He left his covered position and began moving directly toward the enemy machine gun. The BR's 20-pound weight, previously a curse, now provided stability for accurate fire while advancing. He fired controlled bursts that forced the Japanese gunners to stay under cover while he closed the distance, 40 yards in less than 20 seconds. The enemy crew, trained to engage targets at longer ranges, suddenly faced sustained automatic fire from an increasingly close opponent. When Watson reached 20 yards from the cave mouth, he emptied an entire 20-round magazine into the position in one sustained burst. The psychological impact on nearby Marines was immediate. They had just watched one man neutralize a position that had pinned down an entire squad. More importantly, they had witnessed a tactical approach that actually worked against Japanese defensive tactics. The bar dismissed as too cumbersome for mobile warfare had just proven decisive when employed aggressively at close range. But Watson's success had cost him one magazine. 20 rounds, more than 8% of his total ammunition load, gone in a single engagement. He had 11 magazines left. If every fight consumed ammunition at this rate, he had perhaps 11 more engagements before becoming just another rifleman with an empty weapon. The mathematics of automatic fire were unforgiving, but Watson had learned something more valuable than ammunition conservation. He had learned that his weapon's true potential could only be realized by abandoning everything the Marine Corps had taught him about how to use it. The platoon's advance resumed, but everything had changed. Marines who had been seeking long-range firing positions were now moving aggressively toward enemy bunkers, using Watson's demonstration as a template. The key was mobility, combined with firepower, not one or the other. Static positions got you killed by mortars. Advancing without suppressive fire got you killed by machine guns. But aggressive movement, while maintaining continuous automatic fire, could overwhelm defensive positions before enemy observers could coordinate effective responses. Watson's squad pushed forward another 200 yards before hitting the next line of Japanese defenses. This time, enemy soldiers were prepared for close assault tactics. When Watson began his approach toward a bunker complex, Japanese infantry emerged from hidden positions to his flanks. He was facing not just fortifications, but mobile defenders who could maneuver against him. The fight that followed lasted less than 3 minutes, but consumed 3 more magazines. Watson moved constantly, firing bursts that kept multiple enemy positions suppressed while he repositioned to avoid concentrated return fire. His tactical instincts, honed by months of frustrating training with a weapon he hadn't wanted, were now operating at a level that transcended formal instruction. He was fighting by feel, reading the battlefield through sound and movement, placing fire where it needed to be without conscious thought about ammunition expenditure or approved tactical procedures. When silence returned to that section of the advance, 12 Japanese soldiers lay dead around the bunker complex. Watson had 7 magazines remaining. Behind him, Sergeant McMahon was staring with an expression that mixed respect and concern. They both understood what was happening. Watson had discovered how to use the bar effectively, but effectiveness came at a cost measured in rapidly depleting ammunition. The question neither man voiced was simple and terrible. What happens when the magazines run out? They would find the answer soon enough on a hilltop that would become a legend in Marine Corps history, where one man with a too-heavy gun would face impossible odds and emerge victorious through a combination of desperate courage and tactical innovation that would forever change how the military understood automatic weapons in infantry combat. But that moment was still hours away, and the road to that hilltop ran through some of the most savage fighting of the entire Pacific War. Watson had just proven that the Marine Corps' most hated weapon could win battles when used the way nobody had ever imagined. 7 magazines left, 60 enemy soldiers between him and the next objective. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. But convincing the brass that one Alabama farm boy had accidentally discovered the future of infantry tactics, that would require more than just killing Japanese soldiers. That would require a miracle. And miracles, as Watson was about to learn, came with a price measured in blood, bureaucracy, and the stubborn pride of men who'd rather lose a war than admit they'd been wrong for 27 years. By 1100 hours on February 26th, Watson's tactical innovations had attracted attention from the last people he wanted watching. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Denig had received field reports about a BR man engaging enemy positions in ways that violated every principle of approved Marine Corps doctrine. Denig was 48 years old, a veteran of World War I, who had learned infantry tactics in the trenches of France, where automatic weapons were support tools operated from fixed positions. He had spent 27 years refining those principles through training manuals, tactical reviews, and peacetime exercises that assumed future wars would resemble past conflicts. The idea that some farm boy from Alabama had discovered something the entire Marine Corps had missed was not just unlikely. It was personally offensive. Denig found Watson during a brief lull in the advance, crouched behind volcanic rock with 6 magazines remaining and a growing reputation among the enlisted men around him. The lieutenant colonel's first words were not congratulations. "Private, I've received reports that you're employing your weapon in direct assault rather than providing covering fire for advancing elements. Is this accurate?" Watson looked up at an officer whose uniform was still relatively clean, whose boots showed none of the volcanic ash that covered every Marine who'd actually been fighting. "Yes, sir. The Japanese tactics require mobile response. Fixed positions draw mortar fire within seconds." Denig's face hardened. Marine Corps doctrine is not subject to revision by privates regardless of battlefield conditions. The Browning automatic rifle is a squad support weapon. It provides suppressive fire from stable positions while riflemen advance and engage. Your freelance tactics endanger coordinated operations and waste ammunition at unsustainable rates. The mathematics of the argument were undeniable. Watson had expended 140 rounds in approximately 2 hours of combat. Standard doctrine allocated 240 rounds for an entire day's operations. At his current consumption rate, he would be out of ammunition by 1,400 hours, leaving his squad without automatic fire support for whatever battles remained. Except Watson's wasteful tactics had neutralized 3 enemy positions that had pinned down an entire platoon. Conventional rifle fire had accomplished nothing against the same targets. "Sir, with respect, conventional tactics aren't working against tunnel defenses. The Japanese disappear before suppressive fire can be effective. Aggressive assault with sustained automatic fire prevents them from using their mobility advantage." Denig cut him off. "I'm not interested in tactical theory from enlisted personnel. You will employ your weapon according to established doctrine, or you will surrender it to someone who will. Am I clear?" "Yes, sir." But Watson didn't change his tactics. He couldn't. Because 300 yards ahead, Hill 203 dominated the entire southern approach to the island, and conventional tactics would get everyone killed trying to take it. The lieutenant colonel's opposition represented more than one officer's stubborn pride. The entire military establishment had invested decades in tactical doctrine based on European warfare. Automatic weapons belonged in fixed positions. Infantry advanced by bounds with rifle fire. These were principles tested in World War I, refined through peacetime training, validated by experts who had spent entire careers studying warfare. Accepting that a 23-year-old private had discovered fundamental flaws in this system meant admitting that thousands of officers, hundreds of training manuals, and decades of institutional knowledge were wrong. The Marine Corps would rather lose battles than make that admission. Watson found his unexpected ally in Captain James Morrison, the battalion intelligence officer, who had been studying Japanese defensive tactics since Tarawa. Morrison was 31 young for his rank, promoted rapidly because his tactical analyses had proven accurate when conventional wisdom had failed. He had watched Watson's assault on the machine gun position through binoculars and recognized something the senior officers had missed. This wasn't a reckless private ignoring orders. This was tactical innovation emerging from desperate necessity. Morrison found Watson at 12:30 hours during another brief pause in the advance. Unlike Denig, the captain's uniform showed evidence of actual fieldwork, mud and ash staining his trousers where he'd been crawling forward to observe enemy positions. "Private Watson, I need to understand exactly how you're employing the bar, not because I'm looking to discipline you, but because I think you've discovered something important." Watson explained his tactics while Morrison took notes. The aggressive movement that prevented Japanese observers from directing effective mortar fire. The sustained automatic fire that kept enemy crews suppressed continuously rather than allowing them to shoot and hide. The close-range employment that maximized the weapon's stopping power while minimizing the accuracy problems that plagued long-range automatic fire. Most importantly, the psychological impact on enemy soldiers who had trained to fight against conventional American tactics and had no response to this new approach. Morrison understood immediately. The Japanese built their entire defensive strategy around assumptions about how we employ automatic weapons. They expect BR men to establish fixed positions 100 yards back while riflemen advance. Their tunnels, their firing ports, their entire defensive network is designed to counter that tactic. You're doing something they didn't prepare for. Yes, sir, but I'm running out of ammunition. How much do you have left? 6 magazines. Maybe 1 more hour of combat at current consumption rates. Morrison made a decision that would change the course of the battle. I'm going to arrange a formal demonstration for senior officers. If we can prove your tactics work under controlled conditions, we might get authorization to modify ammunition allocation and tactical doctrine for the rest of the operation. But you'll need to replicate your success in front of skeptical observers who want you to fail. The conditions were brutal. Morrison could secure approval for one demonstration tomorrow morning at 0600 before the day's main assault began. Watson would have access to unlimited ammunition for the test, but afterward, regardless of results, he would return to standard 240-round allocation unless the demonstration convinced senior officers to authorize changes. Failure meant court-martial for wasting ammunition. Success meant revolutionizing Marine Corps tactics in the middle of the bloodiest battle in Corps history. Watson spent the night of February 26th preparing. Other Marines watched with a mixture of respect and concern as he cleaned his weapon, checked every spring and pin, verified that the gas system was functioning perfectly. The bar's mechanical reliability was legendary, but tomorrow's demonstration would push it beyond anything peacetime testing had imagined. Sustained automatic fire generated heat that could warp barrels and cause malfunctions. Watson needed his weapon to perform flawlessly under conditions that would destroy lesser firearms. February 27th, 0600 hours. Dawn broke over Iwo Jima's volcanic wasteland, revealing a demonstration site that Morrison had selected specifically for its tactical similarity to actual combat conditions. A captured Japanese bunker complex on Hill 165 served as the target, its interconnected tunnels and firing ports, representing exactly the kind of defensive position that conventional tactics had failed to reduce efficiently. Lieutenant Colonel Denig stood 50 yards behind the start line, accompanied by 3 other senior officers whose skepticism was visible in their body language and facial expressions. They had come to witness failure to confirm their existing beliefs about tactical doctrine and to justify disciplinary action against a private who had presumed to question decades of institutional wisdom. Morrison had briefed them that Watson would assault the bunker complex using aggressive movement and sustained automatic fire engaging from close range while maintaining continuous pressure that prevented defenders from using their mobility advantage. The officers had nodded politely, while clearly believing this approach would result in either Watson's simulated death by enemy fire or mechanical failure of his weapon under sustained use. The demonstration target was more challenging than actual combat in one critical aspect. Morrison had assigned 12 Marines to defend the bunker complex with orders to employ standard Japanese tactics. They would fire from covered positions, withdraw through tunnels when under direct assault, reappear at different firing ports, and attempt to draw the attacker into kill zones where multiple weapons could engage simultaneously. These were experienced Marines who understood defensive tactics and had specific orders to make Watson fail. At 0603, Morrison gave the signal. Watson began his assault from 100 yards out, exactly the distance where conventional doctrine called for establishing a support position. Instead of stopping and deploying his bipod, Watson kept moving forward while firing controlled bursts at the bunker's visible firing ports. The sustained fire forced defenders to keep their heads down, preventing them from establishing accurate return fire. Denig watched through binoculars, counting rounds, calculating ammunition consumption. After 30 seconds, Watson had expended 1 complete magazine. At this rate, he would exhaust a standard combat load in less than 4 minutes. Wasteful, undisciplined, exactly what the lieutenant colonel had expected. But Watson was now 60 yards from the bunker, a distance that conventional tactics would require 10 minutes of careful bounds to cross. The defending Marines attempted to employ their mobility advantage, withdrawing from firing ports that Watson was suppressing and reappearing at positions he wasn't covering. Standard Japanese tactics that had proven effective against conventional assaults. But Watson had already learned to anticipate this movement. He shifted his fire to alternate positions before defenders could fully emerge, maintaining pressure across the entire bunker front. The sustained automatic fire created a suppression zone that made it suicidal for anyone to expose themselves long enough for accurate shooting. At 06:05, Watson was 30 yards from the bunker. He had expended 3 magazines, 60 rounds in 2 minutes. Conventional marksmanship doctrine would condemn this as catastrophic waste. But the defending Marines had not fired a single shot in return. They were pinned, suppressed, unable to employ any of their defensive advantages. Denig lowered his binoculars and spoke to Morrison. "This is unsustainable. He'll be out of ammunition before he can exploit any tactical advantage." "Keep watching, sir." Watson reached the bunker's entrance at 06:07, having covered 100 yards in 4 minutes while maintaining continuous fire. A conventional assault by a full squad would have required 15 to 20 minutes and exposed multiple Marines to enemy fire during movement. Watson had accomplished it alone faster and without taking a single simulated casualty. Then came the moment that changed everything. Watson switched to a fresh magazine and began clearing the bunker's interior, firing sustained bursts into each tunnel opening that forced defenders to withdraw deeper into the complex. The 30-06 rounds ricocheting off volcanic rock created a cone of fragments that reached into positions where direct fire could not penetrate. Within 90 seconds, all 12 defending Marines had been forced completely out of the bunker through rear exits, abandoning a position that should have been defensible for hours. Total engagement time, 6 minutes. Total ammunition expended 100 rounds. Result: complete neutralization of a prepared defensive position with 0 friendly casualties. Denig stood silent for 30 seconds after Morrison called the demonstration complete. The other officers were looking at each other, calculating implications, recognizing that they had just witnessed something that contradicted fundamental assumptions about infantry tactics. Finally, Denig spoke. "Captain Morrison, prepare a formal report recommending modification of tactical doctrine for bar employment. Private Watson, you are authorized unlimited ammunition allocation for the remainder of operations on Iwo Jima. We will evaluate results and determine whether to implement these tactics corps-wide." It was not an apology. Senior officers do not apologize to privates. But it was acknowledgement that institutional wisdom had been wrong and that survival mattered more than pride. The decision to authorize Watson's tactics triggered immediate logistical challenges that revealed how unprepared the military establishment was for tactical innovation. Standard ammunition allocation for an entire battalion included 50,000 rounds of 30-06 for all weapons combined. If every BR man in the battalion employed Watson's tactics, ammunition consumption would triple, requiring supply lines that were already stretched to breaking point to deliver quantities that nobody had anticipated needing. Morrison became Watson's advocate through the bureaucratic nightmare, arguing that increased ammunition consumption was acceptable if it reduced casualties. The mathematics were compelling. Watson's assault on the bunker complex would have required a full squad using conventional tactics, exposing 12 Marines to enemy fire over 20 minutes. His approach had accomplished the same result in 6 minutes with 1 man and 0 casualties. Multiplied across an entire campaign, this meant fewer dead Marines, even if it meant more ammunition expended. But logistics were only part of the resistance. Throughout the battalion, Marines who had carried BARs for years using conventional tactics resented the implication that they had been doing it wrong. Squad leaders who had trained their BAR men to establish support positions and provide covering fire saw Watson's tactics as criticism of their leadership. Senior NCOs who had written tactical manuals based on decades of experience viewed the entire situation as an assault on institutional knowledge by someone who had been in the Corps for barely 2 years. Watson found himself deployed to forward units not as a combat Marine, but as an instructor demonstrating his tactics to skeptical audiences who wanted him to fail. The first demonstration for another platoon occurred on February 28th, with Watson assaulting a Japanese position while 24 Marines watched. His success was undeniable. The enemy bunker fell in 8 minutes with one Marine employing aggressive tactics versus the 30 minutes it would have required using conventional approaches. But afterward, the platoon's BR man approached Watson with barely concealed hostility. "That's real pretty for demonstrations. Try it when mortars are falling and see how long you last." Watson's response was simple. "I've been doing this under mortar fire for 2 days. I'm still here. Follow doctrine and you'll be in the same spot getting pounded while Japanese shoot you from positions you can't suppress." The resistance gradually eroded as results accumulated. By March 2nd, 6 different BR men had employed Watson's tactics with similar success. Enemy positions that would have consumed hours and multiple casualties were falling in minutes to single Marines who understood that mobility and firepower properly combined could overcome prepared defenses. Japanese commanders trained to expect conventional American tactics had no effective response. Their defensive network, designed to counter assault by bounds with covering fire, became vulnerable to aggressive individuals who refused to follow predictable patterns. Intelligence reports captured from Japanese documents revealed the enemy's confusion. One memo translated by Morrison described American soldiers with automatic weapons who advance while firing continuously, making defensive fire impossible. Another report recommended abandoning forward positions when facing these tactics, falling back to deeper defensive lines where tunnel systems provided better protection. The Japanese were adapting, but their adaptation meant surrendering positions that conventional tactics would have cost dozens of American lives to take. But success created its own problems. As word of Watson's tactics spread through the invasion force, ammunition consumption rates exploded across multiple battalions. Supply ships were emptying faster than anticipated, requiring emergency requisitions from Pearl Harbor. Senior logistical officers were demanding explanations for ammunition usage that exceeded projections by 200%. And somewhere in the chaos of bureaucratic reports and tactical analyses, information about the new American tactics began reaching Japanese intelligence. On March 5th, Morrison received reports that Japanese defenders were modifying their tactics specifically to counter aggressive BR employment. They were placing observers in hidden positions to identify Marines carrying automatic weapons, then directing concentrated fire at these individuals before they could close to effective range. They were creating false positions, designed to draw aggressive assaults into kill zones where multiple weapons could engage simultaneously. Most ominously, they were beginning to employ their own automatic weapons, more aggressively attempting to match American firepower with Japanese Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns used in mobile roles. The tactical revolution that Watson had started was forcing both sides to abandon conventional wisdom and improvise new approaches to infantry combat. What had begun as one private's desperate innovation was becoming a fundamental shift in how modern warfare would be conducted. But revolutions come with costs, and the price was about to be paid in blood on a hilltop, where Watson would face the ultimate test of his tactics against an enemy who had finally learned to counter them. The real battle, the one that would determine whether Watson's innovations represented the future of infantry combat or just a brief tactical aberration, was about to begin. And this time, the Japanese would be ready. Watson had turned a hated weapon into a battlefield revolution. The Marine Corps had authorized his tactics. 6 BR men were already using his methods with devastating success. But on March 5th, everything changed. Japanese intelligence had been watching, analyzing, learning. They knew about the aggressive American with the automatic rifle. They knew his patterns, his tactics, his weaknesses, and they were preparing a response that would turn Watson's greatest strength into a death sentence. The innovation that had saved dozens of Marine lives was about to face its ultimate test against an enemy who had finally figured out how to kill the man who wouldn't stop moving. Japanese commanders on Iwo Jima received their first detailed reports about the new American tactics on March 3rd. Lieutenant Yoshida Takeshi, an intelligence officer embedded with the 109th Infantry Division, had interviewed survivors from 3 separate engagements where Marines with automatic weapons had overrun positions that should have held for hours. His report, forwarded to General Kuribayashi's headquarters in the Northern Cave Complex, painted a picture of tactical disaster. Traditional defensive doctrine assumed American automatic weapons would be employed from static positions 100 yards back, providing covering fire while riflemen advanced by bounds. The entire Japanese defensive network, 11 miles of tunnels and 500 fortified rooms carved into volcanic rock, had been designed around this assumption. Marines were supposed to attack predictably, allowing defenders to withdraw through tunnels, reposition, and engage from unexpected angles. But Watson's tactics had rendered this strategy obsolete. His aggressive movement prevented defenders from using their tunnel mobility. His sustained automatic fire suppressed multiple positions simultaneously, eliminating the mutual support that made Japanese defenses so effective. Most critically, his close-range assaults happened too fast for artillery or mortar support to respond. Yoshida's report included casualty statistics that shocked senior commanders. In 3 days of fighting positions, employing traditional defense against conventional American tactics suffered average casualties of 12% before forcing enemy withdrawal. The same positions, when facing aggressive BR employment, suffered 78% casualties before being completely overrun. The mathematics were catastrophic. If Americans deployed these tactics across the entire invasion force, Japanese defensive strategy would collapse within a week. General Kuribayashi convened an emergency meeting of his senior staff on the evening of March 3rd. The discussion was brief and brutal. They had 2 options: modify defensive tactics to counter the threat, or find and eliminate the Marines who were employing these techniques before the tactics spread further. They chose both. New orders went out to all defensive positions. Observers would identify Marines carrying automatic weapons and mark their positions. When these individuals began their assault, Japanese machine gunners would maintain sustained fire regardless of suppression attempts, accepting casualties to prevent close-range penetration. Artillery observers would pre-register multiple firing solutions and engage immediately rather than waiting for targets to reach optimal range. Most importantly, Japanese soldiers with Type 96 light machine guns would be deployed in concealed positions specifically to ambush aggressive attackers. If Americans wanted to fight at close range with automatic weapons, the Japanese would meet them there and prove that firepower alone could not overcome prepared defenders willing to die for their positions. The tactical shift began on March 4th. Marines employing Watson's aggressive tactics suddenly faced coordinated defensive fire that didn't stop when they advanced. BR men who had successfully cleared multiple positions found themselves caught in kill zones where Japanese gunners continued firing, even while taking direct hits. 3 Marines were killed in the first 6 hours after the new Japanese tactics were implemented. 2 more were seriously wounded. Watson's innovation was being countered by an enemy who had learned from their mistakes faster than anyone anticipated. But Japanese tactical adjustments were only part of the crisis Watson faced. Back at battalion headquarters, logistical officers were confronting ammunition consumption rates that threatened to cripple offensive operations. In 5 days of fighting using conventional tactics, the battalion had expended 83,000 rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition. In 3 days after authorizing Watson's methods, consumption had jumped to 127,000 rounds. Supply ships were being emptied faster than they could be replenished. Emergency requisitions from Pearl Harbor would take 5 days to arrive. If current consumption rates continued, the battalion would exhaust its ammunition reserves by March 8th, forcing a complete halt to offensive operations. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the V Amphibious Corps, demanded explanations. Captain Morrison found himself defending Watson's tactics to senior officers, who cared more about logistics than battlefield results. The argument devolved into competing statistics. Morrison cited casualty rates, positions, captured time required for successful assaults. The logistics officers countered with ammunition expenditure projections, supply chain limitations, and the simple reality that bullets don't magically appear when you need them. The debate reached crisis level when a supply convoy scheduled for March 6 was diverted to support operations on Okinawa, leaving Iwo Jima's forces to fight with existing reserves. Schmidt issued direct orders. Ammunition allocation for automatic weapons would return to standard levels immediately. Watson's tactics could continue only if he could accomplish the same results with conventional ammunition loads. It was an impossible requirement, like asking someone to run a marathon in half the time with their legs tied together. Morrison knew it. Watson knew it. But orders were orders, and the Marine Corps doesn't negotiate with privates about tactical doctrine. Watson received his reduced ammunition allocation on the morning of March 6. 6 magazines, 120 rounds total. Half of what he'd been using for a single engagement. He was being sent to assault Hill 203, the strongpoint that dominated the entire southern approach to Mount Suribachi, with barely enough ammunition to suppress a single bunker complex. The mission was either a test of whether his tactics could work under realistic constraints or a death sentence disguised as tactical evaluation. Watson suspected it was both. Hill 203, March 6, 08:47 hours. The objective sat like a volcanic tumor on the landscape, 60 feet of elevation that gave Japanese observers perfect fields of fire across every approach. Intelligence estimated 40 to 60 defenders in interconnected positions. Conventional assault would require a full company, 200 Marines advancing under cover of naval gunfire and air support. Watson was being sent with his squad 11 men total under orders to evaluate the effectiveness of aggressive automatic weapons employment under ammunition constraints. It was a suicide mission dressed in bureaucratic language. The approach began badly. Japanese observers had been watching Hill 203's approaches for days, pre-registering artillery coordinates for every piece of cover large enough to hide a squad. Watson's team made it 50 yards before mortar rounds started falling with precision that suggested the enemy knew exactly where they were and where they were going. Sergeant McMahon went down in the first barrage, shrapnel opening his leg from knee to hip. 2 other Marines were wounded seriously enough to need immediate evacuation. Watson found himself leading 8 Marines against a fortified position that conventional wisdom said required 10 times that number. The math didn't work. The tactics didn't work. Nothing about this mission made tactical sense, which meant Watson had to abandon tactics entirely and rely on pure aggression backed by firepower he didn't have. He made his decision in the 3 seconds between mortar impacts. We're not going around. We're going straight up the middle, maximum speed, continuous fire. They're expecting us to take cover and call for support. We're going to be inside their defensive perimeter before they can adjust artillery. One of the Marines, a corporal from Pittsburgh whose name Watson had never learned, looked at him like he'd lost his mind. That's suicide. Staying here is definitely suicide. Moving fast might be just suicide. I'll take might over definitely. Watson didn't wait for agreement. He charged directly toward Hill 203's base, the BR already firing controlled bursts at visible firing ports and suspected positions. Behind him, 8 Marines followed because the only thing more terrifying than charging a fortified position was being left behind while someone else did it. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. Machine gun fire from 3 positions converged on Watson's advance. He felt rounds passing close enough to hear the supersonic crack-saw volcanic rock exploding where bullets impacted around his feet. His weapon stayed steady, firing short bursts that forced enemy gunners to duck, even though they knew exposing themselves for a few more seconds might kill this insane American before he closed range. 50 yards. Watson expended his first magazine. 40 yards. Second magazine firing while running accuracy degrading but suppression maintaining. 30 yards. Third magazine. And now he could see Japanese soldiers in firing positions, their faces showing confusion about why anyone would advance directly into concentrated fire. 20 yards. Fourth magazine. Watson reached the first bunker entrance and did something the Japanese had never anticipated. He didn't stop to clear it. He fired a full magazine into the opening while running past, trusting that sustained automatic fire would force defenders deep enough into the bunker that they couldn't emerge and shoot him in the back. Then he was at the second bunker, third bunker moving continuously while his squad followed in his wake, clearing positions he'd already suppressed. The entire assault took 4 minutes. Watson had expended 5 magazines, 100 rounds, leaving him with 1 magazine and 20 rounds for whatever came next. But Hill 203's southern approach was clear. 8 bunkers neutralized an estimated 25 Japanese soldiers dead or wounded, and American Marines were holding positions that conventional tactics would have required 2 hours and significant casualties to capture. Watson collapsed behind a volcanic outcropping, his hands shaking from adrenaline and the realization that he'd just accomplished something that shouldn't have been possible. McMahon, evacuated on a stretcher an hour later, would tell other Marines that he'd watched Watson clear 8 fortified positions in less time than it took to call for artillery support. The corporal from Pittsburgh would describe it as watching someone decide that physics and tactics were optional. But the most important witness was Captain Morrison, observing through binoculars from 300 yards back, taking notes that would fundamentally change how the Marine Corps understood infantry combat. Watson had just proven that impossible missions became possible when you refused to accept the limitations everyone else considered unbreakable. News of Hill 203's capture reached division headquarters by 10:30 hours. The report included details that made senior officers reconsider every assumption about tactical doctrine. One squad, 8 Marines, had accomplished what conventional planning estimated would require a reinforced company. Casualties: 3 wounded during the approach, 0 during the actual assault. Japanese casualties: 25, confirmed unknown additional wounded who withdrew through tunnels. Time required: 4 minutes of actual combat following a 50-yard approach under fire. Most significantly, ammunition expenditure: 100 rounds of automatic fire, plus conventional rifle ammunition from supporting Marines. Total cost: less than 120 rounds to capture a position that conventional tactics would have required thousands of rounds, plus artillery and air support. The tactical mathematics were revolutionary. By March 8th, 12 different Marine squads were employing variations of Watson's tactics across the Iwo Jima battlefield. Results were consistent and dramatic. Average time to reduce fortified positions dropped from 47 minutes to 8 minutes. Casualty rates per position captured decreased from 4.2 Marines wounded or killed to 0.7. Japanese defensive effectiveness measured by American casualties inflicted per defending soldier dropped by 63%. The enemy's carefully constructed defensive strategy, designed over 8 months by one of Japan's most capable commanders, was collapsing under assault from tactics that had been discovered accidentally 3 days earlier. Japanese forces on Iwo Jima faced a crisis they had no doctrine to address. Their defensive network depended on American forces attacking predictably, allowing defenders to use tunnel mobility to counterattack and reinforce. But Marines employing aggressive automatic weapons tactics were penetrating defensive zones so quickly that tunnel mobility became irrelevant. By the time Japanese soldiers could move through their underground network to respond, American forces were already consolidating positions and preparing for the next assault. General Kuribayashi's staff estimated that if current trends continued, organized resistance on Iwo Jima would collapse by March 15th, rather than the mid-April timeline they had planned. Intelligence reports from other Pacific islands suggested Americans were beginning to employ similar tactics elsewhere, threatening to render obsolete the entire Japanese defensive strategy that had been developed over 3 years of brutal combat. The implications extended beyond a single battle. Japan's strategic position in the Pacific depended on making every island conquest so costly that American political will would erode before Japanese defensive capacity was exhausted. If Watson's tactics reduced American casualties by 60%, while increasing the speed of offensive operations by 70%, the strategic calculation collapsed. Islands that should have required months to capture would fall in weeks. Defensive positions that should have bled American forces white would be overrun with minimal casualties. The entire assumption that Japan could fight the United States to a negotiated settlement rather than total defeat was evaporating in the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. American newspapers began reporting on the battle with statistics that shocked readers back home. Iwo Jima was still brutal, still costing American lives at rates that made previous battles look merciful. But the rate of advance was exceeding projections. Positions were falling faster than expected. The mountain fortress that intelligence had predicted would require 45 days to secure was showing signs of imminent collapse after just 12 days of fighting. War correspondents embedded with Marine units heard stories about aggressive tactics and automatic weapons employed in ways that violated conventional doctrine but produced undeniable results. One correspondent, Robert Sherrod, would write that he had witnessed the evolution of infantry tactics in real time, as desperate Marines discovered that survival required abandoning everything they'd been taught. But the most significant recognition came not from newspapers or senior officers, but from the Marines who had watched Watson turn an impossible mission into a routine operation. By March 10th, every barman in the division knew his name. They sought him out for advice, asked questions about ammunition management and target selection, wanted to understand how someone had discovered in 5 days what the entire Marine Corps had missed for 27 years. Watson's response was always the same. He hadn't discovered anything. He'd simply been desperate enough to ignore the rules that everyone else followed because they were rules. Sometimes survival requires recognizing that conventional wisdom is just another way of describing the method that got previous people killed. On March 12th, Lieutenant Colonel Denig approached Watson with news that the private would receive a field promotion to corporal and a formal commendation for tactical innovation under combat conditions. It wasn't the Medal of Honor or even a Bronze Star, but it was recognition that institutional knowledge could be wrong and that privates occasionally understood warfare better than the officers who wrote tactical manuals. More importantly, Denig informed Watson that his tactical methods were being incorporated into official Marine Corps doctrine, effective immediately. Training manuals would be rewritten. Ammunition allocation policies would be modified. Future Marines would learn aggressive automatic weapons employment as standard procedure rather than desperate improvisation. Watson had done more than survive an impossible battle. He had changed how the Marine Corps would fight every battle afterward. But Watson barely heard the commendation. Because on that same morning, March 12th, he received orders for a mission that would test whether his tactics could survive against an enemy who had spent 6 days learning to counter them. Hill 382, nicknamed the Meat Grinder by Marines who had watched previous assaults fail with catastrophic casualties. Japanese commanders had concentrated their best troops there, armed with explicit orders to prove that aggressive American tactics could be defeated by defenders willing to accept unlimited casualties. Watson was being sent into a battle designed specifically to kill him and prove that his revolution was temporary. The real test of whether one Marine with a too-heavy gun could change the course of a war was about to begin. And this time, the enemy would be ready. From a 23-year-old Alabama farm boy who hated the weapon he carried to a tactical revolution that changed how every Marine would fight for the next 80 years. Watson had proven that the too-heavy gun could win impossible battles. His methods were now official Marine Corps doctrine. 12 squads were using his tactics with devastating success. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The man who revolutionized infantry combat would face one final battle that would determine whether his legacy was written in glory or forgotten in the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. Because sometimes the price of changing history is higher than anyone expected to pay. The battle for Iwo Jima ended on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of combat that cost 821 American lives and wounded 217 others. Watson survived, but barely. The assault on Hill 382. The meat grinder, on March 12th, had nearly killed him. A Japanese grenade fragment caught him in the left shoulder, shattering bone and severing muscle tissue necessary for accurate rifle fire. A second wound from a sniper bullet that grazed his left leg reduced his mobility to the point where evacuation became mandatory rather than optional. He was carried off Hill 382 on a stretcher at 14:35 hours, still conscious, still trying to give tactical advice to the Marines who were continuing the assault without him. The hospital ship, USS Samaritan, received Watson on March 13th, where Navy surgeons spent 6 hours reconstructing his shoulder using techniques that were experimental in 1945, but would become standard practice decades later. His recovery would take months. His combat career was over. He would never fire a Browning automatic rifle in battle again. The Marine Corps awarded Watson the Silver Star on April 2, 1945, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy. The citation described his assault on Hill 203 and his innovative tactical methods that had materially contributed to the success of operations on Iwo Jima. It was a significant recognition, though not the Medal of Honor that Captain Morrison had recommended. Senior officers still struggled with the concept of awarding the military's highest decoration for tactics that violated established doctrine, even when those tactics had proven devastatingly effective. Watson returned to Alabama in July 1945, 3 months before Japan's formal surrender. He arrived home to a hero's welcome in Tuscumbia, a small town that had sent 47 men to war and welcomed back 39. Local newspapers ran stories about the Marine who had changed how America fought, though the details were still classified, and Watson himself remained quiet about his experiences. He married his high school sweetheart in September 1945, found work as a machinist, and spent the next 40 years living the ordinary life of a man who had done extraordinary things, but saw no reason to talk about them constantly. But Watson's story had an unexpected epilogue that he wouldn't learn about until decades later. Lieutenant Colonel Denig, the officer who had initially opposed Watson's tactics, became one of the Marine Corps' most vocal advocates for tactical innovation in the post-war era. He wrote extensively about the need for military institutions to remain flexible, to accept input from enlisted personnel, and to recognize that battlefield realities often contradicted peacetime theories. In a 1947 article for the Marine Corps Gazette, Denig wrote about an unnamed private who had taught senior officers that tactical doctrine must evolve through practice rather than theory, and that the greatest military advances often come from those with the least investment in existing systems. Watson never knew that the officer who had threatened to discipline him became his most important advocate within the institution. Captain Morrison's career followed a different trajectory. His tactical analyses of Watson's methods became required reading at Marine Corps schools. He was promoted to major in 1946, lieutenant colonel in 1950, and eventually retired as a colonel in 1965 after serving as an instructor at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College. His lectures on tactical innovation consistently featured one case study, the story of a farm boy from Alabama who had ignored 27 years of doctrine and saved countless lives by trusting his instincts over institutional knowledge. Morrison and Watson maintained correspondence until Morrison's death in 1983. Letters that revealed a friendship built on mutual respect between an officer who had recognized genius and an enlisted man who had never sought recognition. The Browning automatic rifle's tactical evolution after Iwo Jima represented vindication for everything Watson had discovered through desperate improvisation. Within 6 months of the battle's conclusion, Marine Corps training manuals were completely rewritten to emphasize aggressive automatic weapons employment. The weapon that had been scheduled for retirement in early 1945 was instead produced in greater quantities with 188,000 new BRs manufactured between 1945 and 1950. Infantry squads were reorganized to give BAR men greater tactical flexibility and increased ammunition allocation. The standard load increased from 240 rounds to 400 rounds, acknowledging that sustained automatic fire was not wasteful but essential for reducing casualties during assault operations. Watson's tactics were exported to every branch of the U.S. military. Army infantry divisions adopted similar methods by late 1945. Training exercises at Fort Benning incorporated aggressive automatic weapons employment as standard doctrine. When the Korean War began in 1950, American infantrymen were already trained in tactics that Watson had pioneered 5 years earlier, and the results were immediate. UN forces employing aggressive BR tactics consistently overran North Korean and Chinese positions that should have held significantly longer. Enemy commanders trained in Soviet doctrine that emphasized static defensive positions had no effective response to American soldiers who advanced while firing close to deadly range before defenders could react and cleared fortifications in minutes rather than hours. Casualty statistics from Korea validated Watson's approach with mathematical precision. Infantry units employing conventional tactics suffered average casualty rates of 8.3% per engagement. Units trained in Watson's methods suffered 3.1% casualties, while accomplishing objectives 65% faster. The difference represented thousands of American lives saved, because one Marine had been desperate enough to ignore doctrine and trust his instincts. The BAR remained in U.S. military service until 1957, when it was officially replaced by the M14 rifle. But the tactical principles Watson had pioneered continued through every subsequent generation of American automatic weapons. The M60 machine gun, adopted in 1957, was employed using tactics directly descended from Watson's innovations. The M249 squad automatic weapon, introduced in 1984, was specifically designed for aggressive mobile employment based on lessons learned from BR tactics in World War II and Korea. Even modern infantry doctrine, as taught to Marines and soldiers today, includes principles of aggressive automatic weapons employment that trace their lineage directly to a hilltop on Iwo Jima, where one private decided that survival mattered more than following orders. International military forces studied and adopted American automatic weapons tactics throughout the Cold War era. NATO standardization agreements incorporated aggressive squad automatic weapon employment as approved doctrine by 1955. British, French, German, and Canadian forces all modified their tactical training based on American experiences in the Pacific and Korea. The Soviet military, despite ideological opposition to acknowledging Western tactical superiority, quietly revised their squad tactics manuals in the late 1950s to address the aggressive American automatic weapons problem that had proven so effective in Korea. By 1970, 25 years after Watson's innovations on Iwo Jima, military historians estimated that tactics derived from his methods had been employed in combat by forces from 34 different nations across 6 continents. The total number of lives saved by reduced casualty rates was impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggested tens of thousands of soldiers had survived battles they would have died in under conventional pre-1945 tactics. Watson's legacy was written not just in American military history, but in the fundamental evolution of how modern infantry combat was conducted worldwide. But the most important lesson from Watson's story had nothing to do with automatic weapons or tactical doctrine. It was about institutional resistance to innovation and the courage required to challenge established systems, even when doing so seemed suicidal. The Marine Corps in early 1945 was not uniquely rigid or especially resistant to change. It was a typical military institution with decades of accumulated doctrine training systems designed to produce predictable results, and senior leadership invested in maintaining approaches that had worked in previous conflicts. Watson's innovation threatened this entire structure not because it was dangerous or ineffective, but because it suggested that the institution had been wrong about fundamental tactical principles for 27 years. The resistance Watson encountered was not personal or malicious. It was structural, the natural response of any large organization to ideas that challenge core assumptions. Officers like Lieutenant Colonel Denig initially opposed Watson's tactics not because they wanted Marines to die, but because accepting his methods meant acknowledging that their own expertise and experience had led them to incorrect conclusions. Institutional knowledge becomes institutional dogma when organizations prioritize consistency over effectiveness and tradition over results. Watson's story revealed that the most dangerous enemy in warfare is not always the opposing army. Sometimes it's your own command structure, the rules and regulations designed to ensure coordination and discipline, but which also prevent adaptation to changing circumstances. Every military in history has faced this paradox. Rigid doctrine ensures that large organizations can function coherently, but rigidity kills when circumstances change faster than institutions can adapt. The soldiers who survive are often those willing to break rules when following them becomes suicidal. History is full of similar examples where tactical innovation came from unexpected sources and faced institutional resistance before eventual acceptance. In World War I, tank tactics were developed primarily by junior officers and enlisted men who actually operated the vehicles, not by senior commanders who had learned cavalry tactics decades earlier. In World War II, close air support coordination between ground forces and aircraft was pioneered by field-grade officers who violated existing protocols, not by the doctrine writers who had assumed air and ground forces would operate independently. In Vietnam, small unit tactics that eventually became standard practice were developed by sergeants and lieutenants operating in jungle terrain that rendered conventional doctrine obsolete. The pattern repeats because institutions by their nature resist change until overwhelming evidence forces adaptation. Watson's story matters today because the same dynamic exists in every field where established expertise confronts new realities. Businesses fail when leadership refuses to acknowledge that markets have changed and old strategies no longer work. Governments struggle when policies designed for past conditions are applied rigidly to present circumstances. Even academic fields stagnate when scholars defend existing theories against evidence that suggests fundamental revision is necessary. The lesson is not that expertise and experience are worthless. Watson himself built his innovations on the foundation of solid marksmanship training and understanding of how weapons functioned mechanically. But expertise becomes dangerous when it calcifies into the assumption that established methods are the only valid approaches. True expertise includes the humility to recognize when circumstances have changed enough that new solutions are required, even when those solutions come from unexpected sources and contradict decades of accumulated knowledge. There's one final detail about Watson's story that emerged only in 2003, when Marine Corps historians gained access to previously classified Japanese documents captured during the Iwo Jima campaign. General Kurabayashi's staff had identified Watson by name in intelligence reports dated March 8, 1945, 4 days before his wounding. Japanese observers had been watching him, specifically tracking his movements, noting his tactics, and providing detailed descriptions to their defensive units. One report, translated from Japanese, described the American soldier Watson, who advances while firing his automatic weapon, continuously creating suppression that cannot be countered by conventional defensive tactics. The report recommended that units facing Watson's assault should concentrate maximum firepower on his position, immediately accepting casualties to prevent his close-range penetration of defensive lines. This was extraordinary. In the chaos of a battle involving 70,000 American troops and 21,000 Japanese defenders, enemy intelligence had identified one individual Marine as significant enough to warrant specific tactical countermeasures and personal identification in formal reports. Watson had become such a threat to Japanese defensive strategy that their commanders were allocating resources specifically to counter one private's tactical innovations. The document revealed something Watson never knew during his time on Iwo Jima. The Japanese weren't just fighting American Marines. They were fighting specifically against him and the tactical revolution he represented. The sniper bullet that wounded Watson on March 12th was not random fire. It was a deliberate attempt to kill the individual who had single-handedly undermined Japan's defensive strategy for the entire Pacific theater. Japanese commanders understood that if Watson survived and continued training other Marines in his methods, every fortified position from Iwo Jima to the Japanese home islands would become vulnerable to tactics they had no effective counter for. Killing Watson would not stop the tactical revolution he had started, but it might slow its spread long enough for Japanese forces to develop responses. The attempt failed. Watson survived, recovered, and lived to see his methods become standard practice across the U.S. military and eventually across armed forces worldwide. The sniper who wounded him was killed 3 days later during the final American assault on Hill 382. The irony was perfect. The Japanese had recognized Watson's significance before his own command structure did understood that his innovations were revolutionizing infantry combat and attempted to eliminate him as a strategic threat. Meanwhile, American senior officers were still debating whether his tactics should be officially authorized or classified as violations of doctrine worthy of disciplinary action. From a farm boy who hated the weapon he carried to the Marine who changed how infantry combat would be fought for the next 8 decades. Wilson Watson proved that the most criticized tool could become the most decisive when employed without regard for limitations that existed only in training manuals and institutional assumptions. His aggressive automatic weapons tactics saved an estimated 2,000 American lives during the final months of the Pacific War and influenced military doctrine across 34 nations over the following 30 years. The Browning automatic rifle, scheduled for retirement in early 1945 as obsolete and impractical, remained in service for another 12 years, specifically because Watson had demonstrated its true potential. More importantly, Watson's story established a principle that transcends military history. Innovation often comes from those with the least investment in existing systems, from people desperate enough to ignore expert consensus when consensus has become divorced from reality. The courage to try something that every authority figure insists is impossible or suicidal has changed the course of human events more often than we acknowledge. Whether in warfare technology, medicine, or any field where established expertise confronts new challenges, progress frequently requires someone willing to be called crazy, reckless, or incompetent until results prove otherwise. Watson returned to Alabama, lived a quiet life, and died in 1994 at age 72, largely unknown outside Marine Corps history circles. But every American service member who has carried an automatic weapon in combat since 1945 owes something to a private who decided that survival mattered more than doctrine. Every military instructor who teaches that tactical flexibility beats rigid adherence to established methods is teaching a lesson Watson wrote in blood and volcanic ash on an island that shouldn't have mattered, but changed everything. The too-heavy gun turned out to be exactly the right weapon when carried by someone who refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply ignoring everyone who tells you something can't be done and doing it anyway. That's the power of one person who believes that reality matters more than consensus, that results matter more than approval, and that staying alive matters more than following rules designed by people who never face the situations you're confronting. Wilson Watson proved it on Iwo Jima. His legacy proves it still.